Good morning. Good morning to each and every one of you. I hope you had a wonderful night last night. First and foremost, I would like to thank Fasecolda and Jorge Humberto for the invitation to have me here to share with you what is happening in Colombia in terms of competitiveness and productiveness with a perspective from the business sector. At the Competitiveness Private Council, we're a private entity, and we work jointly with government to improve conditions of competitiveness in Colombia with a long-term vision, especially in the business sector perspective. My presentation is divided into three parts: the national context of competitiveness, proposals to attain a more competitive country, and the immediate challenge, which is productivity. The first thing I want to say, and I believe this is very important, to recognize where Colombia has done right and why it is so important at present to focus on competitiveness and productivity for what has been accomplished until now simply doesn't go to waste. The truth is that Colombia has had undeniable economic accomplishments in the last 15 years, but there is still a lot to do. And this is the growth of Colombia's GDP. Oh, I don't have a pointer. The growth of Colombia's GDP since 2000 through 2015. And we clearly see that Colombia, in terms of economic growth during this period, did much better than the rest of Latin America. I would like for you to keep this graph in mind because it coincides. This shape, this bell shape, coincides with the boom of commodities prices. So during these years, Colombia grew well above Latin America. What else happened during these years? The per capita GDP of Colombia improved considerably between 2000 and 2015. It grew faster than the GDP of the rest of Latin America. Although in terms of goals we had set as competitiveness system, in terms of what should be the per capita income of the population, perhaps the progress was not the one we had set as a goal. In addition, something that is very important is that during these years, poverty dropped from 50% to 28%. And below poverty levels reduced from 18%. What happened here? Well, I can still carry on. The destitution, no, extreme poverty, it dropped from 18 to 8.5%. And as a result of these progresses, during these years, something that Colombia was able to attain was that for the first time in history, the middle class exceeded the class in conditions of poverty. And today, the middle class is 21% of the population, while the class of people in poverty conditions account for 28%. Well, here I go. And what is very interesting and needs to be taken into account is that whereas today we have a middle class that exceeds the class in poverty level, it is also true that people or the population in a vulnerable condition has also grown considerably. And that is the population that we need to care for. We cannot allow that the progress made these years is reverted. And once again, these people who are in a vulnerable condition fall back into poverty levels and reach poverty levels that we had in the year 2000. This is unemployment. In terms of unemployment, this is perhaps the variable where Colombia scores less than the rest of Latin America. average unemployment rates are above the average unemployment rate in Latin America. But this is like the beginning of the story, the period or the moment where we are, and why moving forward we need to make very big efforts in terms of competitiveness and productivity in order to reach growth rates that are above 4% and allow us to maintain what has been reached thus far. In terms of competitiveness, what happened during these years? What implications have these partial progresses had over international rankings? The truth is very little. The growth Colombia experienced during these years, where the trade winds coming from the commodities, pricing, but in competitiveness and productivity, we stayed behind. When you look at international rankings on competitiveness, where we're compared with the rest of the countries, I'm going to focus on the purple line, but overall, in the doing business, we've ranked better. In 2006, we ranked 76. The doing business is among 180 some countries, so we are compared with the entire world practically. We improved. It's the blue line. We ranked 34 in 2016. Yes, the methodology changed, and then we dropped to number 54. In IMD, which is the orange line, it is a Swiss ranking that compares Colombia with a group of 62 countries. Mostly developed countries is competing there. Is much more complicated. And in this indicator, Colombia does not rank well. We rank 58th. And the purple is the Global Competitiveness Index of the World Economic Forum. These results were published a week ago, the results for Colombia for 2016. In this indicator, we follow continuously, and we study in depth the details of the pillars that are affecting our country's competitiveness. So what are the factors that hinder a faster progress in competitiveness in Colombia? These are the results of what was published last week. To understand these results, it is important to understand that the WEF, first, it divides or classifies the country according to their per capita income. So a country with low development needs to necessarily focus on improving its basic conditions of competitiveness, because that's the first thing any country should need to do in order to compete. Colombia is a country with middle development, and it should be focusing mainly on what is called the drivers of efficiency. It should have exceeded the basic conditions and should be dwelling deeper in market efficiency, efficiency of the labor market, what drives competitiveness. And the most developed countries, that is the only way to be more competitive is via significant progress in business sophistication and innovation. How did we do? Last year, Colombia ranked 61st. Here it is. This year, we ranked 64th. That is, during this year, Colombia lost 5 positions. It is important to clarify here that in terms of the rating of all the conditions, it's the same one it had a year ago, but the progress was not as fast, and 5 countries made faster progress than Colombia and ranked above us. So what happens to us? I was telling you that Colombia should have surpassed the basic conditions for competing, but unfortunately that it's in basic conditions where we do worse. And where in the worst result as a country is that in terms of quality of the institutions, Colombia ranks 117th among 137 countries. It is a very dishonorable condition for one country, for a country that on average ranks 66, but that additionally is a country with a mid development. As a country develops, the quality of its institutions should also improve. Where do we also do poorly? In elementary education and health, in infrastructure, elementary education and health, although we improved 2 positions, ranking 88th is definitely a very mediocre position. Even furthermore, if you're thinking about productivity and competitiveness, if you don't have a population that from the foundations is educated, it is very difficult to attain progress in productivity. Infrastructure, we rank 87th. It is key to understand that infrastructure is not only the highways, but connectivity, all types of connectivity, even including electricity. And in macroeconomics, where we always did better than this year we fell nine positions because of the worsening of the macroeconomic conditions, especially what deals with the fiscal deficit and inflation. But these are what, as a country, we should have overcome. And then where we should be focusing is in efficiency of the goods market and the labor market. But here we lost positions. And what is efficiency of the goods market? It's simply for competition to operate, that markets operate adequately, that there isn't protected pricing of raw materials, that for the markets to operate adequately, for the economy to be open. And what's the labor market? Similarly, that there be flexibility in the labor market. In these 2 areas, we do poorly. And similarly, in the area of innovation, where we rank 73rd, this is what has to do with the business sector. We're also doing poorly. We are 73rd, although we improved 6 positions. But being 73rd is not necessarily a position that gives us peace of mind, and this is where we should also focus our efforts. So to conclude this section, where does Colombia need to focus? And when you talk about an administration that's about to end and a new one to come in, if Colombia wants to make progress in competitiveness and productivity, it will necessarily need to focus on this area of basic conditions in these 2, market efficiency and innovation. I'm going to show you a bit what happens within each of these. This is the map of how the risk of corruption operates in the country. And what one sees is the green parts to the yellow is the areas where you can do business without a high risk of corruption. But all the remaining areas is where you see the likelihood of corruption being very high. And what one sees is that the departments with alerts in the transparency index of public entities is in the peripheries, and it is the Colombian departments where institutional conditions are the weakest. Here, the credibility of efficiency of justice, and there we rank 122 out of 138 countries, and only 40.7% of Colombians do not trust on judges and magistrates. In fact, I think this would be a higher figure. And in Colombia, to resolve a legal dispute, it takes 1,288 days. That is above all of the average, which are approximately 360, 400 days. In terms of education coverage, the essence of a country's competitiveness, 16 out of 100 children of age of being enrolled in education do not have access to basic or elementary education, and 60% of children enrolled in first grade do not graduate from education, high school education. And another issue we have, and we haven't been able to resolve, is what happens with the transportation sector. We're building the highways, but it is clear that highways without an efficient transportation system and additionally without an operating logistics system, well, the accomplishments are not going to be as high. The average age of the vehicle park in Colombia is 21 years, and we're only ranking behind Nicaragua in Latin America. And this is a result of these number of strikes during the years that do not allow us to make progress. And there's also other issues like pricing, there's no free competition, etc. And something I also wanted to point out is that in Colombia, well, we saw that in education, net coverage is 84%. But the thing is that in Colombia, the data we're looking at are data of the national average. But when you go into the level of each department, you find that Colombia has departments that are in the first world and departments that are definitely in the poverty level, like African countries. And this happens, and this comes from the Departmental Competitiveness Index that we built together with Universidad del Rosario, which we did with the purpose of understanding what happens at a department level, for there to truly be a focus as to what is necessary for Colombia's competitiveness to improve. In terms of institutions, for instance, the gap is huge between one department like Antioquia, which is the best in institution quality, and Bolívar. In infrastructure, the primary roads in good condition, Caldas is a department which is shining. The doing business came out yesterday, and Manizales is the leading city in terms of doing business, facilities for doing business. And Magdalena department, which is in this last place, and the gap between Santander and Guaviare in terms of education coverage is immense. Where Santander has 100% coverage, Guaviare barely reaches 50% net coverage. And these gaps that we have in the country are so large. The one that exists in education between Santander and Guaviare, just like it exists in the Global Competitiveness Index from the WEF, between a country like Singapore or like Mali or Liberia. That is the Colombia where we are. That's the Colombia that we have to work on so that we can increase all the levels. In terms of market efficiency, well, this figure is well known. Effective income for partnerships and partners reaches 70% of the profits. And in terms of informality, only 3,400 companies pay 68% of the income tax that's collected and 21% of the total. The tax burden of income tax in Colombia is concentrated among 3,441 companies, 68% of the collection. So if you do a new tax reform, what would need to be done would be to expand this and allow or get more companies to pay taxes. This data surprises people. Foreign trade only weighs 26.5% of GDP, whereas in 1990, the year when it is said that the opening of the economy was done and was going to hurt Colombia, it was 27%, just like we have today. And additionally, 76% of each 100 goods imported are regulated by a non-duty measure. So if you want to improve productivity and competitiveness, you require competition, for there to be competition in the market's rivalry. And informality in the labor market, the pension system is losing many millions of pesos a year. In terms of innovation, the causes of this lagging is the low private investment in innovation. Only 23% of companies are thinking about doing something in terms of innovation to improve access to markets and productivity. There's lack of good practices and technologies. 95% of new companies are using technologies that are over 5 years old. And there's low sophistication in our productive processes. 90% of companies do not use new technologies in their processes. So this is like the scenario of competitiveness of the Global Competitiveness Index of WEF. Now, Colombia, after the drop in commodity prices, lost 2 points of potential growth, or, well, there isn't an agreement as to what was lost exactly, but its potential growth did see a reduction, and this means that today Colombia could be growing at approximately 2%, and it necessarily needs to find new sources of growth. One is clearly productivity. When you look at the growth of Colombia's economy in the period we saw, how it was comprised, I want you to first look at China. When you see China's figures, a growth of 9.7 points, 5% were explained by productivity. One point was explained by employment, and 3.7 by investment, by the capital. When you look at this and you do this exercise for Colombia, what you see is that of that growth experienced during those years, which on average was 4.2%, productivity only explained 0.2% of the growth, whereas employment explained 2.5 and physical capital 1.5. When you look at investment figures, Colombia had very important data during that period. And something else happened additionally that is worth mentioning. That is, in 2002, Colombia's unemployment rate was close to 20%. During those years of growth, the unemployment rate dropped until reaching 9%. Some periods it was even below that. And this is what fed the labor market, all these people that started entering the labor market. And this explains why during this period we had a growth. The growth we had essentially explained by employment and the capital. When we look forward and we say, well, now in a situation where perhaps investment is not going to be what we had, although investment has not dropped, but assuming investment continues the same, we do have a factor, and it's the factor of human capital. Colombia is losing its demographic bonus. The population, less people are entering the labor market. And unless you can formalize the economy, one could sort of maintain that entering of human capital into the labor market constantly. But it's no longer have sources of growth. So the only way to grow is clearly, given that we have a constant, what we have in investment, and we maintain a constant in human capital, to grow, we necessarily need to improve productivity. And this is an exercise we did where in the first part you clearly see the participation of capital in the years during which productivity was a negative contribution to the growth, and how it would have to be to indeed have like a GDP, to maintain a GDP above 4%, and the difference, let's say, between the potential we have and the likelihood of reaching those rates should have to be given by productivity. This is total productivity of the factors in Colombia vis-a-vis the rest of countries. Colombia is the orange line, and it is compared with the countries of the region, and where one clearly sees that productivity in Colombia practically during these years, 2000 to 2015, remained practically stagnant. Here we see what is the employment productivity, or the work productivity per person, how much a worker produces versus what a worker produces in the other countries you see here. And of course, the productivity of the US is 5 times Colombia's productivity. The blue is OECD, orange is Latin America, which is above Colombia, and Colombia is the green line. And Colombia is always compared with South Korea, which was at a point much lower than Colombia in the 50s, and now it triples the productivity of a Colombian worker, one worker in South Korea. As a result of this, and when you look at it at a sector level, what do we see? We see that on average, one needs 5 workers in Colombia to do what one worker does in the United States or produces in the United States. Here, depending on the sector we're analyzing, well, labor productivity is lower or higher. So in the sectors that are labor intensive, where there's greater informality, which is agriculture, transportation, trade, is where productivity is lowest and where many workers are needed to produce what one produces in the United States. And the most capital intensive ones, the ones above, which have a greater labor productivity. So when you go in to say, well, the task is to improve basic conditions in terms of competitiveness, but not ignoring macroeconomic conditions. So the task in terms of productivity is what? And it is nothing different, or total productivity is nothing different than the sum of the productivities of each of the sectors, which in turn depend on the productivity of each of the companies that are a part of that sector. So a sector is productivity is high or low depending on the productivity of each of the firms. And here we divide this into 2 parts. One is, well, if that is so, then on what does internal productivity depend, and on what depends that the economy, the resources be allocated correctly so that indeed there is an effective growth. And what we see here is that internal productivity of a company, any company in any sector, depends on, it is favored by the regulations that foster competition and promote innovation. Second, the adoption of good technological and managerial practices. Third, access to financing. 4, and I believe this is very important, that there be a culture of business growth, that indeed one grows thinking of creating more productive companies that generate greater value. And a fundamental part is that they have pertinent and competitive human capital. And when we look at on what depends the correct allocation of resources, that is the capital and the work in the economy, we see that there are factors that affect this significantly, which is regulation, which facilitates the exit of unproductive businesses or companies. Colombia is a country where the companies live the most without them necessarily being productive. They vegetate. That there be an ease or facility that is doing business, the facility for doing business, that it be easy, that there is not so much regulation, that companies can grow. The reduction of entry barriers to new companies, removal of distortions on profitability, and this means that there be a free goods market, that goods can flow adequately, that there be free competition. Also, a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship in the regions and the country, that there be intense competition, and something that's fundamental, flexibility of the labor market. And what does this mean? This means that things need to continue happening, like those that happened in 2012 with the tax reform, which reduced the parafiscal contributions, and this allowed for the hiring of more labor, but also for the cost of termination be not as high or as expensive. And when one talks about flexibility of the labor market, and when one talks about competitiveness and productivity, well, the bills, draft bills who are at the Ministry of Labor should be put into a drawer locked because they attempt against productivity and competitiveness. So when you look at what happens in Colombia, this is a study we conducted, the Private Competitiveness Council and the Universidad de los Andes, especially with Marcela Eslava and Hernando Zuleta from SEDE. And what we see is, look at the total growth of productivity from 1996 to 2012 is the yellow line. And what explains this growth? When you look at the green line, which is the internal growth of the companies, the productivity of the companies in Colombia, we see that the behavior of total growth is very similar to the growth of productivity within the companies. It practically determines it. And what is the efficient reassignment of resources in the companies, but it is insufficient to compensate this such low productivity of the companies. Here, the efficiency of this reassignment or reallocation makes a positive contribution but does not sufficiently compensate the poor internal growth. I recently saw an exercise by the central bank in Cali where it analyzes productivity of the companies in different sectors. And what it analyzed, this is very impressive and serves as a starting point, is that the 10% are the most productive with very high productivity, and the rest, 90%, is comprised by small and medium-sized companies that are unproductive or non-productive companies. Or it could also be, well, in the sector, there's some that are more productive and others with very low productivity. When the exercise is done of increasing the productivity of all to a middle point, an average point, the production of that sector, without adding a peso, increases by 25%. So the space for improving productivity is amazing. Similarly, in this same study with the university, when we look at on what does productivity depend, when in practical terms you look at the business and say, well, those companies that were able to attain such high productivity, why did they do it? Because they focused on doing the homework of doing what was necessary to improve productivity. And this graph in the bottom, what it says is that 66% of earnings in productivity of the companies is a result of their efforts in gains in new processes, 35%, and gains from innovation in new products. So for productivity, the efforts made by companies is necessary. And what this study shows is that only 38.7% is explained by external factors. So yes, Colombia needs to work in improving its competitiveness environments. That's a reality. But companies also must take a leap to improve their productivity. And this is one of the obstacles to reach international markets. If you are not productive, well, it is very difficult to compete in international markets. This is something that I like to show because it's also a result of this study, and it is that public resources are not allocated to the most productive sectors, but to those that have a greater influence. So what this graph shows is that the companies that have the greater electoral importance are the ones that received the most resources. Those who are represented by a trade association are followed by those from an economic group, and those who are here, what they're thinking is in being productive and not so much in looking as to how appropriate these public resources. Here I'm showing, similarly, that this is a market where there's no competition. In general, a market that's little competitive, but the exercise also shows that in the sectors where there's greater competition, where there's many players, the productivity efforts pay, because improving productivity, I can position myself above and gain market share. Whereas a sector where there's 2 or 3 players, it is very difficult, even if I make all the efforts, to rank above and gain market share, because I would need to make twice the effort or double the effort, and even so I cannot gain those share points. And to conclude, these are my final messages. There is no doubt, I want to recognize this, that Colombia made important accomplishments in economic and social matters, but that it needs to preserve. But to attain this, it needs to grow and maintain growth, sustained growth rates over 4%. And for this, we need we cannot wait and see that the world economy is going to grow and there will be a market for Colombia's products. No, Colombia needs to do the homework, and it is mandatory. It is a homework that has to be assigned to all the candidates that are going to be speaking here tomorrow. They all need to understand the macro is key, but the possibility of growing without making recompositions of the basic conditions for competitiveness. This is quality of the institutions. A country cannot develop and grow with institutions that simply do not operate well, where the institutionality of a country is nothing different than the way how we all interrelate amongst each other, where there is trust. If this isn't there, if we don't improve the institutions, it's very difficult. If we don't continue investing in infrastructure, on the one hand, completing the 4G, solving the issues that have blocked them today, and completing the 3 waves, but also working on logistics development of the country, and also the transportation sector, that it be formalized and is essentially productive. And what else? Where we must insist and insist and insist on elementary education. Elementary education that results in people who are receiving an education, not only that they have the coverage, but that they have quality education, and for these people to afterwards to receive pertinent education. Colombia needs to work on this, because productivity ultimately, and via the companies as we saw, largely depends on the people it has to work with. Given the drop in raw materials pricing, the country needs to find new sources of growth, especially through increasing its productivity. The message today is, yes, let's continue with everything on competitiveness, but we need to improve productivity. To think that exercise of those companies that without doing anything at all, simply by being productive, can improve their production by 25%. And it is clear that the country needs to have strategies for the firms, and also to increase efficiency where the resources of the economy are allocated. And these resources of the economy can be used in a better or worse way. If, for example, you generate the incorrect incentives for the resources to go towards one sector, because that's a sector that is protected, that has secured pricing, so the capital goes towards the sectors that not necessarily are the most productive, but those that we saw there, which are the ones that have a greater electoral weight. And well, with this I conclude. Thank you very much.